Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today it's time to have a look at some more stuff which was passed to the developers in October of 2019. After having a look at the ground forces stuff, it is now time to have a look at the naval things, just because I think the naval side of things, even though there's only four ships here, or four types of machine, they are all kind of interesting. They all have their interesting part of history, so I thought, why not do them before getting into the aviation things? To be honest, looking at the aviation stuff, there's a lot of incredibly similar vehicles here, so therefore I'm still working out how to sort them out in a video instead of just repeating myself about 50 times over. So let's have a look. The first one is the Northampton-class style of heavy cruisers, mainly the USS Louisville and also the USS Northampton. So the Northampton-class cruiser, the reason why it would be interesting to see in War Thunder is we pretty much just got its predecessor in the game, the Pensacola class. The Pensacola, of course, being the first heavy cruiser that the Americans have in War Thunder. It was also one of the earliest ones created when the US decided to adhere to the Washington Naval Treaty. So in the late 1920s, they also started building the Northampton-class style of heavy cruisers, which was I suppose an evolution of the Pensacola class. They reduced the weight of the Pensacola class, but also kept the same speed and increased its armor. The way I would see it, and the way at least it is described in this forum post, is that the Pensacola class was very much the prototype of the idea of heavy cruiser that the Americans wanted to go with after they obviously went with the Washington Naval Treaty. And then what happened after that, once they finished the Pensacola class, they refined their ideas when it came to construction, they refined what they wanted to do, and then spawned the Northampton class. So I see this much more as a successor to the Pensacola class than more of a sister or a brother. So looking at this heavy cruiser, the main things that were kept from the Pensacola idea was, of course, the speed and, of course, the armament. So the armament was slightly dropped, though. They went down to 9 guns instead of 10 in 3 sets of triples. You can see right here, this is looking at one of the machines. It had 9 sets of 8-inch guns set in 3 sets of triples. So you can see they had 2 mounts on the front and then 1 mount on the back. It also had access in 1930 to 4 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns, 2 3-pounders, and also 6 torpedo tubes. An interesting thing after looking at these, these Northampton class heavy cruisers, is that they didn't all survive the war. There were 6 of them made, and as you can see, 3 of them were actually sunk during the war, with only the Chester, the Louisville, and also the Augusta surviving. Showing that this was a class which took heavy losses, 50% over the war. So the Northampton class, succeeding the Pensacola, it improved on it in many points. The problem with the Pensacola, as talked about, is it had a few teething issues, and one of them was the actual being at sea, the problem with it controlling itself and all of these wonderful things. The Northampton class improved on this by adding in a raised bow and forecastle, the 3 triple turrets instead of the 10 in 4 mixed turrets, and also an increased width with lowered superstructures. So the speed remained the same, but the armor was increased against destroyer calibers. It was useful against pretty much everything apart from 152 millimeter shells. And also, the other thing to understand is there was increased armor added to the front of this thing to make sure that it could fend off other shots. Post-war, 3 of them surviving, as we talked about, the Chester, the Louisville, and the Augusta. The fact is that they were all decommissioned after 1946 because a bunch of better designs had come around. You've got to remember, this is a late 1920s machine. So by the end of World War II, you're talking about a machine which is about at least 25 years old at that point. And obviously, with the Second World War and also with the 1930s, there was a lot more modern designs which went on, and therefore there was no real need for these machines. So they were decommissioned, and then because they were obsolete, and all three of them were sold for scrap in the 1950s. So they were just gone, and there was no real use for them. The two that are being suggested in this post by Roguestar Flyer are the USS Northampton, which is of course the one of them which sank, and the USS Louisville, which didn't sink. So the Northampton was the lead ship, of course, it shares the same name, commissioned in 1930, and she was originally classified as a light cruiser because of her armor, but then reclassified later on as a heavy cruiser because of the 8-inch guns. And then the interwar period, she basically just was part of training, and then in 1941 she underwent a refit, which replaced the torpedo tubes with the Chicago Piano 1.1-inch anti-aircraft guns. This is something you'll see a lot, at least with larger ships for the Americans. They take away the torpedoes and add in just more anti-aircraft armament. So you can see in 1930 it had access to 6 21-inch torpedo tubes, and by the time of 1941 it had 4 1.1-inch anti-aircraft guns. That is the main difference between the two. They also added in some more 5-inch caliber anti-aircraft guns. So if you wanted, you could add in one in the game which had a bit more armament when it came to destroying other ships in the form of torpedoes, maybe a little bit more skilled armament if you want to see it like that. Or you could add in the 1941 version, which gives itself a little bit more anti-aircraft support. Now, the USS Northampton operated in the Pacific Combat Theater. It was involved in Midway, Guadalcanal, and also Santa Cruz, and during the battle at Tassafaronga, it was struck by 2 torpedoes, which put a huge hole in the port side, and she began to take on water and list. 3 hours later, the ship was abandoned. Even though a lot of the crew escaped, the ship itself was sunk. So therefore, it unfortunately didn't survive the war. It nearly got there, being struck after being part of so many different battles, but unfortunately wasn't able to survive. So the USS Louisville, which is one of the ones which survived the war. The main difference between it is that, first of all, this was the the third of the Northampton-class heavy cruisers, obviously named after Louisville in Kentucky. They have a very interesting university over there if you're kind of interested in that. And it was mainly used in patrols, transport missions, supply transport, and stuff like that. Basically, very much the same as a lot of these, ships of a similar size. It fought in multiple campaigns, just like the Northampton. It fought in Guadalcanal, the Marshall Islands, Peleliu, the Philippines, and Okinawa. Took 2 hits from kamikaze pilots near the end of the war, which knocked her out of action. But she underwent repairs and refits and was stationed at Pearl Harbor following the war's end. And after the Japanese surrender, she supervised the rescue of Allied POWs in Manchuria, and she remained off the Chinese coast until October of 1945. After her return to the States, she was decommissioned in June 1946 and then sold for scrap in 1959. So having a look at this machine compared to the Northampton, if you have a look at its refit, it's slightly different to the Northamptons. The Northamptons was refit in 1941, obviously, as we said, adding some 5 inches and the Chicago piano guns. Then, if you have a look at the Louisville, it wasn't refitted until 1945. So it had its torpedo tubes, and it didn't have its torpedo tubes throughout the war because they removed them in 1934. So those were just gone without anything really being added to it. So they kept the 9 8-inch guns in sets of triples. Then you have the 8 5 inches, the dual purpose guns that we talked about before, 2 3-pounder 47s, and then the 5 quad 40s, 4 twin 40s, and 27 twin 20s. So this would definitely be a machine which would be anti-air savvy. So the Northampton would be very good when it came to annihilating other ships with its main guns. The Louisville would be great at annihilating other ships with its main guns, and also with its anti-aircraft armament to be able to keep it alive. So yeah, the Northampton-class has a lot of interesting ships to it, even though they're all incredibly similar. The main secondary armaments are the place where they definitely differ. I'd like to see these in game, especially since we just got the Pensacola. Sorry, I'm still feeling a bit ill. Since we just got the Pensacola, this is the next logical step on top of that. The next vehicle is kind of an interesting choice. It's the Lutzlow, which is, of course, a part of the Admiral Hipper class of machines. And this is by Ryan Dr. DJ. And the reason why this is a weird choice is because the Lutzlow technically was never finished, even in Soviet hands. So the Lutzlow is the same class of ship as the Admiral Hipper class, and it was supposed to be very similar to it. The only difference is that it would be later built, and also it was supposed to be a little bit more armed. But what actually happened instead to the Lutzlow is that in 1940, I'm guessing the Germans just realized they couldn't finish it, or they wanted to give the Soviets something as kind of like a goodwill agreement. They sold the ship when it was partially built to the Soviets. And the Soviets renamed it the Petropavlovsk, and then it was later renamed to Tallinn in 1944, and then Dnieper in 1953. So this machine was mainly in Soviet hands during World War II. Which is really, really weird. It was actually, it was mainly near, I believe, was it Leningrad? And what happened was, after the Germans sold it to the Soviets, it was stationed there to basically finish the build on it. And what the Germans did when they invaded through Operation Barbarossa, they actually bombed the ship with stuff like Ju-87s. So after selling this ship from the Germans to the Soviets, the Germans ended up bombing the damn thing and trying to knock it out, but they never fully knocked it out. So that was, an interesting thought. Another thing to also think about when we talk about it was about 50% done. It didn't really have a bridge. It didn't really have a central area, as you can see here. But what it did have was 2 sets of the main guns, the 203 millimeters. So therefore, it could still, do a little bit of damage if it needed to, but it never finished off its other main guns. The only guns it ever had when it came to its main armaments were the ones on the lower area right here and right here. What is very odd is this, the problem with this forum post is it doesn't really go into too well what happened with the Lutzlow. Instead, what it does is it talks about the Admiral Hipper. Well, the Lutzlow and the Admiral Hipper are 2 completely different machines, and as you can see here, the armament which is talked about, this is the Hipper's armament, not the Lutzlow. The Lutzlow's armament at most is 4 203 millimeters, a splattering of 105s, and a few 20 millimeters. That's it, because it was never finished. So trying to compare the Admiral Hipper to the Lutzlow, I think, is just a little bit disingenuous when it comes to it, and that's what's happening here, because it would be like putting in a fictional machine. If we're going to do that, if we really want to put in another Admiral Hipper, there are other ships. You've got the Blucher, the Eugen, which I'm sure many people want, and of course the Seydils instead of the Lutzlow. I don't know why you would focus on the Lutzlow, especially because of its history. I suppose you could give it to the Soviets if you really felt like it, but it just seems really weird the way that this whole thing is, the way this whole thing is laid out is it makes you believe that the Lutzlow was finished because if you don't catch the fact that they're talking about the wrong ship for about 60 to 70% of it, and then at the bottom it says right here the additional information is the armament was 4 sets of dual 203mm. No, it wasn't. They never finished it. 6 dual 105s. That can be debated. 6 dual 37s and 3 20mm. Then 4 sets of triple torpedoes. The USSR planned using the unfinished sail Ditz, one of the Lutzlow sisters, to complete her and adding new armaments. Also reclassified her to a light cruiser. Then they were supposed to add this: 4 11180s or 4 11152s, 2 11152s, 2 twin 130s, 2 quad 45s, and 2 quad 25s, 6 quad 25s. The USS also considered options for the armament of the ship with rocket weapons. I couldn't find any information about those guns, the ones USR had planned to add. Yes, it's weird, that, isn't it? God. I hate the word planned. I wish we could get rid of this word planned when it came to the War Thunder community, because it's amazing what you can come up with when you look at what was planned, especially when you look at German and Soviet technology, even American ones like the ones which we had a look at the other day, like the M6E one. So yeah, when it comes to this ship, the only time it was ever really in a position to be used was when it was in the hands of the Soviets in the form of the Petropavlovsk. So I think if we're going to add it, we give it to the Soviets. The problem is, at the same time, it's just a worse Admiral Hipper. So we'll just get eaten by an Admiral Hipper. And also, the Eugen will eventually come and just annihilate it as well. So yeah, it's an odd one. It's a cool story, a cool history story, but it's just one of those ones which doesn't fit too well in the game, unless, you have a look at stuff like the other Soviet heavy cruisers, and you're like, not sure if they would fit either. So yeah, it's just one of those very odd ones. Then you got the HMS Exeter. This is from Terek G 2014. And the HMS Exeter is the second ship of the York class. It was a class of the 2 Royal Naval heavy cruisers built under the regulations of the Washington Treaty. The HMS Exeter was laid down in 1928 and finished in under a year after being launched in 1929. The Exeter first saw combat in the Battle of the River Plate, where alongside the light cruiser the Ajax and the Achilles engaged the pocket battleship the Graf Spee, which of course I'm sure many of you will know. The HMS Exeter overall had a few issues during the war. It seems to have escaped a lot when it came to the amounts of damage it was able to take, but at the same time it was eventually hit and eventually destroyed. The main specifications for this machine: it had 6 8-inch guns in the form of dual mounts. So basically you have 2 dual mounts here, and then one dual mount on the back. Also had access to 4 quad AA guns, 4 4-inch AA guns, and then it had 2 2-pounder guns, 6 21 torpedo tubes. So we're talking about a machine which is definitely not as well armed as many others that we have in the game. But it would be nice to see fit, in the game alongside other classes of ships for the Royal Navy. The Graf Spee, during the battle with the British fleet, the Exeter was badly damaged, and it was able to make it to port and basically got to the Falklands, surprisingly, and was able to get some quick repairs. The damage inflicted on the Exeter was severe, with all the gun turrets being knocked out and losing 61 crew, which is around about 10 to 15% of the overall crew members. Went under underwent emergency repairs and in early 1940 went back to England to make sure to be fully repaired. And it was refit in 1941, and then it served as a convoy escort and then was assigned to the British Pacific Fleet in late 41. She took part in the first battle of the Java Sea, which she survived with some damage. And then the second battle, she was sunk by torpedoes from a Japanese cruiser, and in 1942, she was, in the 1st of March 1942, was fully sunk. And even though 625 men actually made it off the ship out of 628, meaning that only 3 did not make it off, 125 of them died as Japanese prisoners of war, which is incredibly sad when you think about it. So yeah, it would be lovely to see the HMS Exeter. It would add to the ongoing amount of Royal Navy ships, which would fill out those top tiers of the Royal Navy for Britain in the game. It definitely isn't something as good as, the Hipper or something like that, but it doesn't need to be. It's part of history. We should have it in. The last vehicle to have a look at is, of course, Japanese, and this is from Miki Hoshi, and it is the Amatsukaze, which is a Kaguru class destroyer. Now, from my reading of this, it has a really interesting history, and it seems like it survived a lot of problems when it came to engaging the US forces, mainly coming down to it being able to use its long lance torpedoes incredibly effectively, and also on top of this being used throughout the war. This was not a machine that survived the war, but it was one of the Japanese machines which lasted a hell of a lot longer than many others, mainly down to circumstance, but also down to being very useful. So the Kaguru class vessels, there was 19 of them. The Amatsukaze was one of them, and the main difference between it and some others is that the Amatsukaze featured a new prototype compact high-temperature, high-pressure boiler, which was limited to 52,000 horsepower to keep in line with the other Kaguru class vessels. This, even though it was limited and it didn't see the performance gains because of it, it was more efficient than its sister vessels, so it could go for longer distances and be able to churn through at better rates. Also, this set of boilers was used on the famous Shimakaze class, so that is kind of its claim to fame when it comes to its technological prowess. When it comes to its fighting prowess, it was pretty much used in the whole of the Pacific theater. The main battle it was part of, though, was, of course, the Battle of Guadalcanal, where the American forces took heavy losses against the incoming Japanese fleet. The Amatsukaze was able to torpedo at least 2 machines. It was able to torpedo the USS Juno, and also it went on to try and go after the USS San Francisco after hitting the USS Barton as well. So it hit the cruiser, the Juno and the Barton, basically knocking them out of the battle. Then after going after the San Francisco, which was of course the capital ship at the time for the fleet, and it ran into the USS Helena, which of course is the light cruiser which was added to the Americans just last update, and the Helena battered it. It scored several hits on the Amatsukaze, killing 45 members of it, hitting the boiler, knocking out the rudder, silencing the guns, and causing a minor list. The Amatsukaze was able to escape destruction, and then 3 Japanese destroyers, the Azagumo, the Murasami, and the Samidari, engaged the Helena, allowing the Amatsukaze to leave the area under the cover of smoke. So after the battle, it was repaired and it was given a radar detecting device. It was given some triple 25mm AA mounts. As usual, anything that survived long enough was just given more AA on it in the ship category. It was also given a bunch of twin 25mm as well. Then, after Guadalcanal, the Amatsukaze was mainly used for troop transport, convoy escort duties, and with the radar fitted, was actually pretty useful. And then, on a tanker convoy escort duty in 1944, so we're talking about very late war here, the USS Redfin launched a torpedo at the Amatsukaze. It hit her in her forward boiler and splitting the ship in half. The destroyer division commander, Captain Furukawa Bunji, along with 79 of the members, were killed, and Captain Tanaka survived and swam to the aft section of the Amatsukaze, and which remained afloat. The convoy thought that the Amatsukaze was destroyed. Yet the aft remained adrift for 6 days before being spotted by Japanese G4M bombers, and the Amatsukaze was then towed and made emergency repairs and received a temporary bow. So after all of that, after being split in half, this machine is still going. It is still, it is still running around to try and be useful. So during the repairs, the aft was fitted with 3 30mm machine guns, 2 25mm cannons, and also the temporary bow-mounted and aft boiler repaired. She was pressed into escort duties in November. This was mainly because the Americans, by this point, had taken a full grasp on the seas in the Pacific, and there wasn't a lot of Japanese ships left, so they were trying to press everything into service to, keep it going. Now, unfortunately, because it was pressed into service quickly, on the 6th of April in 1945, it was attacked by B-25s and unfortunately was hit 3 times by 500-pound bombs. One of these actually knocked out the one of the rear turrets. The radio room was hit, and also the war room was hit, which is always, a bad thing, since that's where everything is sorted out. Then because the engine area was hit and the boilers were hit, seawater mixed with the oil, the engines failed because of it, and she began to drift, and then it was eventually beached. There was 2 attempts by the Japanese to tow and recover the Amatsukaze, but unfortunately it just didn't work because of poor weather, so therefore it was decided to just leave it there. And eventually, in 1945, it was used as a training target for Japanese bombers until the end of the war. So not a very fun, interesting, end to the Amatsukaze, but it was definitely a ship which was used all over World War II, and the fact that it was split in half and it was able to survive is it's mind-boggling to me, and I'd love to see it in game just for that reason. If we're talking about the Amatsukaze, being the Kaguru class destroyer, it's incredibly similar to the Yugamo class that we already have in game. The minor differences that you have is that the elevation and depression of the main guns, which are 127mm guns, they have slightly less elevation on them, so they only have plus 55 instead of plus 75, and the Amatsukaze as well, it had slightly more crew members, 239 instead of 228 of the Yugamo class, and it had different depth charge rails, so if it was given her fit of 42-43, it would also have superior AA defense to the Yugamo, but also have less than the Kiyashimo. So you can see there are slight differences in this class compared to the Yugamo, but not huge differences. But then again, if you look at general naval history, that's pretty much the difference between a lot of these machines anyway. Slight little differences, which mean a little bit, but not a lot. Then, if you have a look at the armament overall, so it had 3 sets of twin-mounted 127mm, so 6 127mm overall. It had 2 twin sets of 25s, 2 quadruple torpedo sets, and then it had a bunch of depth charges. It did have reloadable torpedo launchers, so it had 16 torpedoes overall, so basically 2 loads, if you want to put it like that. And by 1943, it was given the same main guns, upgraded AA in the form of 2 triple mounts of the 25s, so twin mounts of the 25s as well, and then of course the torpedoes staying the same. By the time of August 1943 as well, the radar warning receiver was added, the Type 22 radar. So if that ever becomes a factor in naval warfare in game, it will be something that the Japanese will have. So yeah, that is the Amatsukaze. If I was going to say the ones which I'd like to see in the game, the Northampton-class is a no-brainer. HMS Exeter would be lovely to see a York class. The Amatsukaze seems really interesting, along with the other Kaguru classes. The Lutzlow is an odd one, as we talked about before, so I'm not exactly sure. I would much prefer to see some of the other project machines from the Soviets before we have a look at something like the Petropavlovsk. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, J. Wilt, John Ryman, Joseph Anders, Martinez, Moxie, Super Cacti, Uyens Terry, Elove Goat, and Seductive Trashcan for supporting the channel.